David Bowie's fourth studio album, Hunky Dory, is regarded by most as the true beginning of Bowie as the phenomenon he became. It marks a clear point in his career where his identity as a major artist was truly realised. It's hard to think of a time when he wasn't considered just that, but in 1970, with poor sales of his latest offering, The Man Who Sold the World, he really was considered mostly a one-hit wonder, with 1968's Space Oddity being his only hit song up until that point. The subsequent tour for the album took him off to the States, where he was inspired by Andy Warhol, Bob Dylan and the Velvet Underground's Lou Reed. So much so that he penned songs in tribute to these encounters when he returned. His normal way of writing would be centred around the acoustic guitar, but for Hunky Dory, he decided to put the guitar down in favour of using the piano as a primary source of inspiration. Bowie proceeded to write over 30 songs back at his apartment in Hayden Hall, many of which ended up on the album, and its follow-up, The Rise and Fall of Ziggy Stardust and the Spiders from Mars. The first song he wrote for the album was Oh You Pretty Things in January 1971. After recording its demo at Radio Luxembourg, it was heard by Peter Noon of Herman's Hermits, who ended up releasing his own version. It made number 12 and brought Bowie back into public consciousness again after Space Oddity, which was now 3 years previous. Heading off to record at Trident Studios with producer Ken Scott, Bowie made sure he got the band back together, knowing they would represent a crucial part of the album's creation. The band in question were Mick Ronson on guitar, Trevor Bolder on bass, Mick Woodmansey on drums, and Rick Wakeman on piano. Wakeman had worked with Bowie briefly before, but the main core of the band had been with him for a while, although they'd been apart for at least 9 months after the disbanding of the short-lived group they put together named Arnold Corns. Keyboardist Rick Wakeman of the Strawbs was one of the top session musicians of the time, and later recalled meeting Bowie prior to their album sessions in late June 1971 at Hayden Hall, where he heard the demos of Changes and Life on Mars. He said, "I heard them in their raw brilliance, the finest selection of songs I've ever heard in one sitting in my life. I couldn't wait to get into the studio and record them." Incidentally, the piano Wakeman played at Trident Studios was the same 1898 Bechstein as used by Paul McCartney for Hey Jude, and later by Queen for Bohemian Rhapsody. Ken Scott was attempting his first proper production role. Although an experienced engineer, having worked with a whole roster of top artists including the Beatles, he hadn't assumed the top role as yet and shared these duties with Bowie for Hunky Dory. Without a record deal actually in place, the team got to work at Trident at a fast pace, attempting to complete 2 songs each day. This wasn't unusual for Bowie, who was notorious for his low boredom threshold when it came to studio work. Ken Scott said that 95% of his vocal recordings were done in just 1 take, and he had an expectation that other musicians should be able to rattle through their parts also. A normal approach would be to play through the songs once to get a feel for it, with a further 1 or 2 takes to absolutely nail it. Failing this, they would then just put the song to one side and try another one. Although Ken Scott was a bit apprehensive in his first role as producer, he wasn't afraid to leave in mistakes when they occurred. One of the most notable was his mispronunciation of Andy Warhol on the track Andy Warhol, where they left in Bowie correcting him at the top of the track. Incidentally, Ken is actually credited on playing the ARP synthesizer on this song also.
This is Andy Warhol, and it's take 1.
It's Warhol, actually.
What does that say?
Hole. It's Hull. As in holes.
Another notable mistake is a bit more subtle, and it's at the end of Life on Mars, where you can hear the studio phone ringing. You can hear the phone ring, but not Mick Ronson swearing at the untimely interference, which was later cut out. Bowie's speedy working style influenced Ken Scott's technical approach. He said, "What I quite often did while recording David's vocals was use an AKG C12A and a U67 and place them at a 90-degree angle to each other, so that it was singing in between them. I came up with this method so I could instantly switch between the 2 mics to see which sounded better, and maybe even use both, instead of having him sing in front of one mic and sing a bit and then go in front of another mic and sing. It also had the added benefit of helping to suppress any popping or sibilance as well. We didn't have many tracks at that time, so even if both mics were used, they were mixed together to a single track. Unlike many of the recordings of the time, we never recorded the effects because David only did 1 take, so there was never any time to set them up. The album was mixed on a 20-input Sound Techniques console, using moderate board EQ and a single EMT plate reverb. and just a little compression on the overall mix. Compression came from the Urie 1176s and two Teletronics LA2As. The multi-track machines were 3M 16-track. Any delay used was from a Studer C37 stereo tape machine with a vari-speed. Mick Ronson was playing his 1968 Gibson Les Paul through a Marshall Major 200-watt amp with two KT88 power tubes removed to reduce it to 100 watts. He removed the pickup covers from the stock humbuckers on his Les Paul to try and get more volume and more aggressive tone. Mick's pedals included the Tone Bender Mark I for fuzz and crucially a cocked wah pedal. By cocked, I mean a wah pedal permanently engaged and slightly dipped to a point that tonally complemented the song and helped it emerge from a mix. Another effect he used was the Echoplex for delays, and the cabs were close mic with Neumann U67s, and occasionally a room mic was used depending on the mix. Trevor Bolder mostly played his Gibson EB3 with flat wound strings. It was quite often DI'd or through a 100-watt Marshall if he needed some grit. He was a big fan of the sound of Jack Bruce, so he'd use the Marshall to get the harder sounds when needed. Mick Woodmansey's drums were set up in the Trident drum booth. On occasion the drums were recorded in stereo, but not always. But they were all on one track with a separate kick track, and sometimes the snare was a separate track depending on the song. Ribbon mics were used for overheads, either STC 4038s or the Bayer M160s, an AKG D20 on the bass drum, and a Sony C38 on the snare. Neumann U67s were used for the toms. Woodmansey said, "I remember listening to a Neil Young album, and on one track I was blown away by how all the way through the song, the drummer never hit the cymbals, and then when he did hit it, it really meant something. So that was kind of the approach for me on Hunky Dory, finding a rhythm and an approach for the song without taking it over. It took around 2 weeks to complete the mixing once the recording was finished, and now it was time to try and find a record label to release it, with the prime target being RCA Records. Its head, Dennis Katz, had never heard of Bowie, but recognised the quality of the songs and signed him to a 3-record deal on 9th of September 1971. RCA would be Bowie's label for the rest of the decade. The album was released with the single Changes on the 7th of January 1972. RCA were reluctant to properly get behind the promotion due to, in their opinion, its unusual cover shot and with knowledge that Bowie would be changing his image very soon for the next album. Because of this, the album initially sold poorly and failed to break the UK album charts, with it barely selling 5,000 copies in the first quarter. Unfazed by all of this, Bowie was actually back in the studio recording Ziggy before Hunky Dory was even released, and it was really the combination of these two albums that secured his deal with RCA. The success of Ziggy brought deserved attention to its predecessor, and sales picked up on the back of it, with it eventually reaching number 3 on the UK charts, which was 2 places higher than Ziggy. These two albums were pretty much recorded back to back, and proved to be a pivotal moment in Bowie's career, with Hunky Dory being the very moment Bowie became the Bowie that would go on to massive success and eventually lead to his legacy of one of rock music's most creative and greatest stars.